Hi everyone, and welcome to Lunchbox Science today. It's my pleasure to be hosting Associate Professor Jody Webster this afternoon. My name's Holly, and I hope that you've packed a really tasty lunch because we do have a treat for you this afternoon. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay respects to their elders past, present and future. Now I am just going to bring Jody in right now, and excellent.
Hi, Holly.
All right. Hey, Jody, how are you going?
Good, thank you.
Okay, so today's Lunchbox Science is going to be presented by Associate Professor Jody Webster. Jody has a keen interest in understanding how climatic and other environmental changes, past and future, impact reefs and their associated sedimentary systems. At the University of Sydney, he is co-coordinator of the Geocoastal Research Group in the School of Geosciences. His research is multidisciplinary in nature, encompassing traditional sedimentology and stratigraphy, combined with the novel use of marine geology and geophysics, paleoecology, geochemistry, and numerical modelling. Jody is also heavily involved in the International Ocean Discovery Program and is focused on recovering sediment cores from the seabed to understand past sea level and climate changes. So now I'm going to hand over to Jody for lessons from the geologic past, the evolution of the Great Barrier Reef in response to major environmental changes. Now at the end, we will be having some time for question and answers. So if you do have questions as Jody speaks with today, pop them in the Q&A function and we will get to those at the end. So Jody, all yours.
Great, thanks, Holly. Hi, everybody. As I said, it's a real pleasure to be here. As Holly said, my name's Jody Webster. I'm from the Geocoastal Research Group at the University of Sydney, and that sits within the Marine Studies Institute. And I've just sort of listed here our website, just to really show you the different places around the world that we've been doing work on coral reefs and coastal systems and other places. And I like to really think of it as the geology of nice places. But we're going to take a journey to the Great Barrier Reef. Sorry, I'll just put on my spotlight here so we can see. Just one, we'll move this over there. Thank you. Sorry, guys. Yeah, we'll take a journey to the Great Barrier Reef. This is one of these beautiful three-dimensional images showing the symmetry of the reef. And we're going to examine the reef in space and time. And what we're really seeing here is a whole part of, or different parts of the system, from the coast to the reef to the shelf and the slope. And we're going to consider this across a whole range of different spatial scales and temporal scales, which I think is going to be hopefully quite fascinating. Now, we'll introduce you to a whole range of all the different types of ways in which we study reef systems, from field-based methods to looking at quite sophisticated numerical models. Of course, we spend a lot of time thinking about, what is the future of the Great Barrier Reef? What we do know, in the last couple of years, there's been one, two, and now a third mass bleaching event, which occurred earlier this year, and the impacts of that are still being assessed. This was really quite troubling for scientists around the world because the frequency and impact of those events. And of course, there's lots of debate about, what is the future of the reef? Now, of course, why do reefs bleach? Why are they impacted? Well, this is a diagram that tries to show how sensitive coral reefs are to a whole range of different environmental parameters, from temperature, which is an issue around bleaching, but all sorts of issues related to sea level, sediments, and nutrients, and so on. So in this talk, we're going to talk about, for example, what happens to the reef if we get, for example, a very, very sudden jump in sea level. For example, the reef could drown. And what does drowning actually mean? Well, drowning is defined in this case as the inability of the reef to keep growing. So it's a strange concept, this concept of drowning, but this is something that we'll consider. And of course, one of the things that that scientists in the past have discussed or thought about is this relationship between the way in which a reef grows and whether it can either keep pace with sea level rise or in fact give up in the sense of this marathon runner here. And of course, we've now come to know that the reef drowning and reef growth is more than just a combination or the relationship to sea level, but also other factors, for example, such as nutrients or sediments, as we're going to show you, are really quite important. So just as a bit of an intro, I just want to show you a very, very brief video which sort of lays out some of the things that we do and shows you some of the really important work some of our group and our students are doing.
The Great Barrier Reef's past can help us predict the future by looking at those periods in geologic history when the Great Barrier Reef has responded and evolved to rapid climate changes. In the face of future global climate change, there's uncertainty about the rate and magnitude of sea level rise, temperature changes, well as increases in sediment runoff. By looking at the Great Barrier Reef's geologic past, we can look specifically at those times in its history where it has grown and in some cases died in response to these environmental changes.
We recovered tens of meters of core and brought back all of these core trays to the lab here, and we start to examine the cores and see exactly what kinds of coral communities were growing at different times, but not just the coral, also see what kinds of other plants and animals are growing at the same time in the cores that are preserved in this fossil record.
Corals are really spectacular recorders of the climate or the ocean that they were growing in. And so we can take a small subsample and then we can measure a whole range of different elements and isotopes to reconstruct temperature, past salinity, sediment runoff. We're hoping to understand what combination of environmental factors has stressed the reef in the past, changed it, perhaps killed it, and caused the demise of the reef. And this has happened again and again and again.
So that gives you hopefully just a little taste of what we're trying to do with respect to looking at the past reef and how we go about using those fossil cores to reconstruct ancient environments. Now, this is, of course, a key point. How do we actually visit the past? How do we sample the past? Well, we can, if the reef or fossil reefs are above on land, we can sample them. This is some work we've done in the jungles in the Seychelles, and not the most traditional way of sampling. There are other techniques where we may actually do it on the reef, on the modern reef itself, and drilling through the reef system. Or if they are submerged under the sea, we may use submarines as all sorts of ways to get at those reefs. This is myself looking somewhat apprehensive as I'm about to go down in the submarine. I think at this stage, I actually, just after doing this, discovered I was somewhat claustrophobic. And of course, ROVs and ships are also other ways that we can sample these reef systems. And of course, we can use now drilling robots to actually sample and recover beautiful coral reef systems. And so the sort of primary questions that drive our group is, how old is the Great Barrier Reef? When and why did it start turning on or grow? What are the processes that affected its development? How did it die? How did it migrate in the past? And how ecologically robust is the Great Barrier Reef to environmental catastrophe? These are all the key questions that we're really thinking about. And I'll just point out here, this is a large group effort with many, many co-authors and collaborators. So we'll kind of launch in. This is an interesting plot that shows sea level over the last 600,000 years or so. And this is sea level that we know has varied on these natural cycles, 100,000-year cycles and smaller cycles from high to low, and so on. And of course, sea surface temperature has changed, pH has changed, and also sediments and nutrients have all been changing over these periods. And of course, we're worried about the future story of the Great Barrier Reef as we move into the future. I like to think of the birth and death, and in fact, recovery of the reef as a whole series of different stories. There's the birth story of when the Great Barrier Reef actually turned on. We're not quite sure about that, between 600, 500,000 years. And then there's what I call the interglacial glacial story, which is the turning on and off of the reef during these high and low sea level periods. And what I call the last ice age or deglacial story is this story of what happened to the reef during the last ice age, and then sea level and climate change out of that. And so we're going to sort of examine that as part of our talk today. And so really breaking it down into the interglacial glacial story, the ice age story, and we'll say a little bit about the response of reefs, and hopefully with the Great Barrier Reef with respect to resilience, and then touch on what it might mean for the future story. So launching right in, as I said, to this glacial story and what we know about this, there's actually been almost a century of really amazing work, geologic work on reconstructing the past evolution of the reef, starting as far back as this excellent, groundbreaking report by the Great Barrier Reef Committee, which was based on a very deep borehole or drill hole that they drilled in the 1920s and 30s through the Heron Reef in the southern Great Barrier Reef. And they came up with this spectacular series of descriptions, down core, down to about 154 meters, very, very detailed work, which was some of the most fundamental work at that time. At the same time, this is an old map showing a reconstruction of paleo channels out on the shelf of the Great Barrier Reef. Here's the land, the shelf, and the slope. And so scientists began to put these pictures together of trying to understand the relationship of the reef to periods of lower and higher sea level, to start to think about how the reef might respond to these major changes in sea level. And they developed these quite really interesting models of what they thought the interior structure of the reef looked like. But they were somewhat hampered by the really poor recovery of these records. So it was an incomplete puzzle or picture. And that held us back for quite a while. Now, just to give you this sort of picture, I tell my students that the Great Barrier Reef is actually like a sponge cake. And each layer of, what we're dealing with right now is just the last layer of that sponge. And we have these two modes of growth, these so-called high sea level or high stand growth, as opposed to this low stand mode. And so you can think of this sort of, basically this on and off switch, switching on between high sea level, turning off, and then turning on again at these different periods. And that's this really, really fundamental control of sea level at this time. One Tree Reef, where the University of Sydney has a research station, I'm just sort of pointed it out here, just to sort of illustrate this sort of turn on, turn off sort of exercise. Here's a visualization, for example, if we've drained the ocean and the sea level is here during the, for example, the last ice age, and then we flood sea level through time across the shelf and turning on the reef during this sort of high stand mode. And this has been repeated again and again and again, setting up this sort of situation. As I said, the previous records that were really innovative and interesting, but they really lacked the recovery or the complete record to really understand what was going on through these processes of turn on and turn off through the sponge cake. And so one of the best records that was drilled during the mid-90s, and I actually worked on this as part of my PhD, so I'm showing my age here, but this was a real advance because we're able to drill two sites, one site off Ribbon Reef 5 off Cooktown, and this was over 220 meters. The key point is that really high recovery and a complete record of what was there. And this really helped to unravel this glacial interglacial story. And here's the platform that was used, which I think was really exciting. So this is kind of a cartoon showing the different stages of reef development. And each one of these layers you can see here was recovered in these cores. And we could identify these major breaks, and there's this evidence of complete and utter exposure during the low sea levels. For example, this is a picture of one of the cores and one of these boundaries which has soil, terrestrial soil, preserved in the reef record. So we can see these different stages. And then another major finding within this core, and here's the depth, I should say, 200 meters below present sea level, and the modern reef, as I said, is right here. And we have these different stages or layers. And because of the quality of this core, we're able to reconstruct this spectacular record of the changes in communities through time, which was really quite amazing. And again, what we're able to see uniquely in this core is what we think is the true turn on or inception of the Great Barrier Reef. And again, we still don't know exactly when that is. And that's a point of future research and another story that we're trying to make advances on. But a sort of key aspect was the recognition of these different coral communities, but more importantly, the repetition of these communities from branching, from massive, again and again and again in each of these different cycles. So that implies that the Great Barrier Reef, as it's turned on, been destroyed completely in this place, and then come back again, it's come back again and again in essentially the same way from a community aspect. And so that implies quite some stability, at least over these large temporal scales, which I think is quite important. And so sort of summing up here is, firstly, the Great Barrier Reef geologically, as best as we know, is very young. The precise timing and the environmental conditions leading up to this event are not well understood. Another part of the story that I didn't have time to talk about was the turn on of the inner shelf, which is quite different. And the sea level has a major control on this repeated growth and demise during these low sea level ice age events. And this sort of sets up this sponge or layer cake sort of stratigraphy. Another major sort of finding is that we see this recurrence of similar assemblages again and again following death and then reassembly, which suggests, again, over these long timescales that the system is quite robust. And a sort of major question is, how does it do this? How does the whole system die and then come back in the same way again and again? And that's the next part of the story, which I think is the really exciting developments in the last 5 to 10 years or so, which we'll talk about now. And of course, to figure out what happens during these low sea level periods, we need to move from this position on the modern reef and the shelf. We need to go out here. We need to go out on the shelf edge in the deeper water where we've moved into this zone where sea level has been, in fact, spent a large portion of its time. And that's where the International Ocean Discovery Project has actually done some really, really nice work. And I'm just going to summarize that now. And so a little while ago now, we led an expedition to go and sample these reefs on the edge of the Great Barrier Reef in 4 sites in the north, Noggin Pass off Cairns and off Hydrographer's Passage. And the idea was to recover samples from this shelf edge. And so this was the ship that we used. You can see the containers on the deck here. There's the drilling derrick on the top of this drilling ship. And this was home for 55 days. And, well, not exactly. We didn't live in here. We lived in the actual ship here, but this was where we spent a lot of time doing the science, which was quite exciting. And just to sort of show you, this is sort of a view of at night on the drilling ship. You can see the drill string going down through a hole in the vessel. This is the moon pool, and this was quite an amazing experience. And so the goal was to recover a whole series of cores from the edge of the shelf. This is one of these beautiful multi-beam maps that we can see. Basically, the modern reef for reference is out here, and this is about 120 meters below present sea level. So we have this series of transactive cores that we collected, just to give you a sense of what that material looks like. This is one of these cores. We can see corals, we can see algae, and it was quite successful in terms of recovering beautiful fossil coral reef material. And just to give you sort of a quick view, this is one of the cores that was actually collected in 90 meters, so on the seabed, drilling over 30 meters beneath the seabed, and we get this amazing array of sediment types, from loose sediments, rock, as well as these fantastic frameworks of coral, cemented lithified sediment, as well as coralline algae, and so on. And then this is the drowned top of the reef, which we'll talk about a bit later. And so this is really, really exciting. We can compare these sorts of the types of corals, the algae, the other sorts of reef biota, and compare that with the modern to reconstruct a history or where the reef, what sort of environment the reef was growing at through different stages of time. And just to give you an example of what that looked like, this is one of these idealized cores. This represents depth below the seabed. So this is 90 meters, depth below present sea level. Okay, so this is on the seabed, and we've drilled, 25 meters, 30 meters below. Excuse me, sorry. And we've drilled and captured this wonderful record of reef growth from and the different changes in environment. So I just want to sum this all up. This is a really terrible diagram that has way too much in it, but it's just to show you the amazing amount of work that's been done by many, many people all over the world in many, many different labs, working for several years to put this jigsaw puzzle together of all these different cores. So I'm going to summarize this down into hopefully a series of quite simpler cartoons. And so this is we define a whole range of 5 different reef sequences and different stages at different stages of sea level. This is the revised sea level curve that was constructed as a result of using the fossil reefs to build the sea level curve. So for reference, this is 20 meters below present sea level. And we have this story of the reef growing as sea level falls to the full extent of the ice age down here. And we get a different stage. And this is defined by these dots that we can see here, which represent the age and depth of the corals in the cores, which define a drop from 100 meters down to 120 meters. And that represents this drop to the last ice age and the growth of the reef at that time. Then, of course, sea level changes and begins to rise, and we get this quite episodic picture of reef growth as we move up and climate changes, backstepping and moving from one position to another as the reef is migrating back across the shelf, which is really quite spectacular, to eventually turning on at this really interesting feature that we call Reef 4, which represents a really, really interesting stage in the growth of the reef, because prior to this point, the reef was not a barrier reef, but a series of fringing reefs, very, very narrow and attached to the coast. And I'll show you a picture of that. This was the first appearance of what we call a barrier, or what I call the proto-barrier reef. And of course, that drowned at about 10,000 years, and we'll talk about that in a minute, before sea level then rising, and then the turn on of the modern reef about 9,000 years ago. So that's like a potted history of the evolution of the reef during this period from the last ice age to our modern reef. Now that has a range of different sorts of implications in terms of really important rapid lateral migrations, both seaward and landward. And we're seeing the same record of this over 600 kilometers apart from the 2 different sites. So we know that this is a regional picture. And of course, we have this clear different stages of demise, be it exposure or reef drowning. And so I just want to talk quickly in the time that I have remaining about this reef 4. This is the stage where the reef starts to become a barrier and then drowns at about 10,000 years. And this is really, really interesting for a range of different reasons, because it represents the stage before the turn on of the modern reef, this last step. And just to sort of point that out, these pink areas represent the locations of these barrier-like structures, which we can actually trace up the entire length of the Great Barrier Reef, which we know have grown and turned on at the same time, at least 500 kilometers apart in these two different sites. And this is summarized here in these diagrams. This is depth below sea level, this is those cores, and these numbers represent the ages, 13,000 years, 10,000 years. And this represents essentially the death or drowning of that reef at the same time. We've died. And the question is why at that time? And this is what we've really been trying to explore. This is a close-up diagram of the age and depth of the dated corals in the core. That's 70 meters below sea level. This represents the top of the core. And I've broken this down into stages. This is the reef growth, and then this represents the death event, the basically turn off of that reef as it switches from shallow to deep growth and then has died. And then what we've been able to do is also calculate how fast the reef is growing in each of these periods. And for reference, this represents the upward or rate of upward vertical accretion or growth of the reef. And this is the modern for comparison, 4 to 5 millimeters per year. And this was actually growing faster than that, really, really going gangbusters. And then of course, it starts to tail off and grow much slower as we reach this point of death. And we see exactly the same picture in the northern site. And so the question is, why is that? And we've started to explore. We don't think it's related just to the rate of sea level rise alone. We think it's related to sedimentation and this process of the shelf being flooded as sea level rises, and this providing stress on the reef. And there is some indirect evidence of this from other work that's been done by colleagues, by Gavin Dunbar and Mike Page and others, looking at sediment cores in the deep basin. And what we can see there in the sediment cores is, this is a measure of sediments, both siliciclastic, by that I mean quartz, terrigenous material from the continent, as well as carbonate sediments. And we see a massive influx to the basin at that time, at around certainly increasing in around 10,000 years. So there is evidence indirectly. Now, what we've begun to do is look closely at the evidence of sea level change, of this reef stress and sediments within the cores themselves. I'll just show you some initial sort of work. So just to sum up again, we have how do we move from a healthy reef to a dead reef? And we can expose that by death by exposure. That's much simpler as sea level falls. But then this drowning, or this inability to keep pace, is another perhaps more interesting factor, which we think is related to sediments and a whole other sorts of environmental factors which we've begun to look at, particularly in that reef 4. Now, the picture is complicated. What we're seeing is this picture of multiple environmental stresses, rates, magnitudes, and we can start to look at a whole range of different geochemical proxies to reconstruct independent records of what the environment was doing, and that's a work in progress. But we're also looking at reef stress, evidence of reef stress within the cores themselves. So I'll just share with you quickly this record of bioerosion. This is work done by Madhavi Patterson, fantastic graduate student in our group, who's looked at a record of bioerosion, the basically worms, sponges, which can potentially be a proxy for the reef being stressed and becoming more bioeroded as it's starting to grow slower and so on. And we actually see a significant increase in bioerosion towards the top of this core and around these drowning events. So that's really quite exciting and interesting. But as I said, it's a work in progress where we can link the records of stress and versus health with the geochemical proxies. And just another really exciting aspect of what we're doing is looking at using sophisticated computer models to model reef growth through time. So this is working with really wonderful colleagues within our group, Tristan Sullies, who's developed some really sophisticated numerical modeling software to model erosion and deposition, and also grow reefs in response to changes in depth, sedimentation, wave energy, and produce different assemblages and communities, and how that responds to physical processes. Also within our group, Ana Villaconsejo, a wonderful colleague of mine who's doing some fantastic work understanding the impact of physical processes and on how it, and waves and so on, how it moves carbonate sediments around, which is helping us understand this in more detail. But just to quickly show you some models, an attempt to sort of reconstruct, or could we drown the reef in response to sea level rise? So this represents our site off Cairns. This is Cairns here, for example. This is a reconstruction of what sea level looked like 15,000 years ago. This is the sea level that we're forced to model with. This is work done by, again, another wonderful student of ours, Amanda Thran. And what we're doing is, this model is raising sea level and changing the environment, and where the red is being shown, we're seeing reef growth in this red area. And so we've tested a whole range of different sea levels with rapid jumps, slower jumps, and what's really sort of interesting in this next shot is a whole series of time steps at 13,000 years, 12,000 years, 11,000 years. In this particular case, we're not able to actually drown the reef. And so our model isn't sensitive enough, or we're not capturing enough of the other environmental factors that are important. And so some additional modeling that Maddie and Amanda Thran have done is basically looking at records of sedimentation rate through time. And so what we have in this particular model, is a really spectacular model. You can see time here, and then all sorts of things happen in terms of both erosion, as defined by this blue area, and then high deposition out on the edge of the shelf during this period as sea level floods back over the shelf. So we're starting to combine and think about the implications of these numerical models with also the geochemical proxies, which we're really quite excited about. So just kind of summing up here, the Ice Age story, highly dynamic system, at least 4 or 5 reef sequences that have grown and shown this remarkable capacity to migrate seawards and landwards. And this has some implications for thinking about reef resilience, of responding to sea surface temperature rises of up to 5 degrees. I'll say that in a minute. The ability to sort of reseed itself, locally is important. And there's these distinct death events. And we're particularly interested in looking at these drowning events, particularly this proto-Great Barrier Reef, as a potential laboratory for what might be happening to the modern Great Barrier Reef, which I'll talk about just finally in a minute. And of course, the next steps is to really continue this work looking at the different proxy records and the numerical modeling, and just sort of moving forward. But I'll just kind of end here. This is a really excellent representation put together by Gaffney and Stefan, which expresses this global climate change mode between glacial and interglacial, and how the world is repeated backwards and forwards through that sort of natural cycles. And in our reef work, what we've done is tried to look at the reef cores in these different interglacial and also these major transitions, and to see what we could learn about how resilient or not these reef systems are to these changes. And I guess there's lots of discussion now about what's happening with respect to modern reefs and more broadly the Anthropocene, and what's the future story. And the issue which I really want to make really clear is the problem and issue is the rate of environmental change that we're seeing now. And for example, the Great Barrier Reef has been responding quite well to these major changes in temperature, for example, 4 or 5 degrees. However, that's over 10,000 years. So the magnitude and rate is so much higher. For example, now, this is the sort of rate that per 100 years, okay, versus what we're seeing right now. So I'll end it right there.
Thanks, Jody. That was really, really fantastic. Really enjoyed hearing about how we've managed to reconstruct these pictures of the Great Barrier Reef that show us that it has sort of gone between, you know, dying and coming back to life. We've got a few questions in the chat, but I just had one to start. You sort of showed a slide maybe 5 minutes ago that sort of said, you know, how reefs die, and you sort of had, you know, exposure and drowning. What we're currently seeing in the Great Barrier Reef, does that fit in one of those categories, or is that a whole new category?
Well, the sort of aspect now, what we have right now is rising temperature and also rising sea level. So the sort of what we have is that sort of potential drowning scenario that we might see if conditions were such and the reef was unable to keep pace on, you know, in the next 100 to 200 years, because there's lots of evidence to suggest that sea level rise, which now is about 3 millimeters per year globally, it may actually accelerate. And so there are fears that reefs may not be able to keep pace with that rise, particularly if their ability to grow is compromised by sea surface temperature and ocean acidification and so on.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, that what sort of sea level rises were we talking about in those previous glacial to interglacial periods?
Over the entire period, over 100 meters, but each reef stage is tracking parts of that sea level, and then at different times it's unable to keep pace with the sea level. In that particular place, it drowns, and the system then migrates and reestablishes itself further upslope. Awesome. And that could be 10 meters away. You know. Yeah,
great. So we actually have, I know we have at least one Year 11 biology class that's joined us for today, which is fantastic. So we sort of got 2 questions that have come from them. First is, where does your research sit if you sort of look at, you know, overall marine science, and how do you hope that other marine scientists would apply your research to sort of increase their understanding of the field?
Right, so yes, I'm a marine scientist, as I said, part of the Marine Studies Institute. I'm also a geologist, part biologist. So I'm kind of a lot of things, wear a lot of different hats. But where I really hope our work can contribute is on 2 main fronts. One is using the reef systems to reconstruct past sea level and climate changes, so we have a better understanding of how our natural climate changes, and that may help us inform us better about future changes. And then the second aspect is, what can we learn about how reef systems have responded in the past to changing environments to make better predictions about how the Great Barrier Reef and other reefs will respond in the future. So it's really those sort of 2 aspects. That's records of environment, and then records of reef response.
And I mean, I guess the really interesting part to highlight there to any student that's watching us is that real interdisciplinary nature of what you do. And, you know, I guess marine science in general, you know, you don't just look at water and you don't just look at sediment, you look at the whole system as a whole, and doing that requires understanding of biology and geology.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, very much. So very, very cross-disciplinary across the traditional fields of biology and geology and marine science and geochemistry, and now working increasingly with, you know, very, very clever colleagues in data science and numerical modeling. Yes, so to tell this story, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and all these different disciplines need to be sort of brought together to tell that story.
Yeah, so I think it's a really great, you know, explanation of just how science in general works. And, you know, any science students watching this, it's really important for them to understand that. Yeah. Cool. I'll just move on to another question now. So we've got a question about, you know, what do we know about the source of the propagules from which the Great Barrier Reef has come back from? So like, where have those seedings come from when it's come back after those die-offs? Right,
so this is a really, really fascinating question. And of course, the major oceanographic current system is the, you know, sort of East Australian current, you know, part of which we should bring, you know, part of the system that brings warm tropical water from the east to the west. And one of the ideas actually exactly was that. Where was the source of propagals to reseed the Great Barrier Reef during these low sea level scenarios? And one of those ideas was that it was further out in the Coral Sea. That may have actually been the nursery, because the edge of the continental shelf of Australia would not have been a good place to actually grow. It wouldn't be a great refuge. But what this work has actually shown, this drilling on the shelf edge, is that, well, it wasn't necessarily a bad place. It was a different place, but the reef was growing there during the last ice age. So we don't need to invoke a regional source, at least during these transitions from ice age to high sea level. We had this kind of local source, and we think that's related to the close connection between the deep environments and the shallow environments, essentially able to reseed the reef system as it migrates. But that's a fantastic, really, fascinating question.
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting. Another really interesting question that's come through is about coral species.
Yes.
Is there any sort of evidence that particular coral species are more resilient than others?
Yes, most definitely. And we actually know this from the modern work, from an understanding of the tolerances of certain coral types. For example, some of the massive domal corals, the Porites is the genera, seem to have higher thermal tolerances and higher tolerances to ocean acidification and so on, higher tolerances to sediment and nutrient influx. I tell my students Porites is sort of the king of corals, and then there are others that are much more susceptible, and I think we see that in our reef records as well, where we're seeing certain coral types and forms in certain types of environments, and that's a good question and very true.
Cool. And with those types and those environments, with the current changes in conditions on our reef, are we seeing different species sort of extend, like for example south as waters warm?
Yes, the answer is yeah. We are seeing range extension, and part of that is related to, there's been lots of fantastic work looking at the extension and intensification of the East Australian current and the sort of tropicalisation of the more southern regions. And we have some really excellent researchers at Sydney University who are doing a lot of work on this aspect. Associate Professor Will Figuera does a lot of this really interesting work. And of course, there's now really compelling evidence coming out of a lot of the work looking at the post-bleaching effect and the change in coral communities, and where the so-called concept of winners and losers, and the winners might be these more simpler forms, and that of course changes the ecosystem when we move from more complex habitats to more simple habitats. So that yes, there's evidence of that, and that we're actually running this sort of grand experiment, if you will, in terms of changing the composition of the Great Barrier Reef on these shorter term timescales.
Yeah, great. Another question sort of tangentially related to that is we've got a question about like coral outplanting efforts and restoration efforts.
Right.
Do you think that ability of the reef to migrate seaward or landwards could or should inform these efforts and help, create new reefs that can cope with the threats that we're seeing?
Yeah, certainly. Well, one of the key aspects is having the right sort of substrates for reefs to actually colonize. So just to, one view might be with, increasing, temperature, why would not all reefs just migrate further south? Now, there is some geologic evidence in different parts of the world where that has happened, at least on a limited extent, but they're not the same sorts of reef, and they're limited in how far and what sorts of environments they could inhabit. In part because you start to run into problems of not having the right sorts of substrates or local conditions. Where do they go? How do they move? And of course, there's other issues of issues around ocean chemistry and ocean acidification, those issues actually become more enhanced as you get further south or into the higher latitudes. But more broadly, what I would hope is that our understanding of this past environmental sensitivity to the reef, may help inform, future predictions.
Yeah, great. So we're just about out of time. So I'm just going to ask one more question. You sort of said the key word a couple of minutes ago, which was hope. And I think when we talk about the Great Barrier Reef and we've looked at everything that has happened over the last few years, we're sort of, sitting there hoping that this system is either able to adapt or, reseed or recover from, the bleaching that we've seen as a result of these really rapid changes. So I guess, given what you've seen with, 600,000 years of changes on the reef, can that give us hope that, the Great Barrier Reef may recover from the current problems, or that we might have that knowledge to help it recover?
Yeah, big question. The Great Barrier Reef, has shown a remarkable capacity over those geologic timescales to grow and come back. I guess it's a case of, on societal timescales, what are we doing or what can we do? And the obvious things are, irrespective of just the reef, but related to ice sheets and ecosystems, is to reduce CO2 emissions. We're probably on a trajectory now already where we're going to see, we're already seeing increased bleaching, and there's questions about acclimation and adaptation and so on. But the reef is changed, or has been changed, and will be changed. And then it's a case of, for all the other ecosystem and environmental issues of reducing carbon emissions. But certainly as a geologist, again, over these geologic timescales, it showed a remarkable capacity. It's a case of what's going to happen and over societal timescales and what we can do about it. And I think what we can do, that message is pretty clear.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a clear message about what we as society need to do in order to change these, change our behaviours so that we might be able to one day, preserve the reef. And Jody, I think you've given us a really great story of the Great Barrier Reef today. So thank you so much for your time and your presentation. From the questions that we've got, I think, everyone who's watched us today has greatly enjoyed it. So I want to thank you on behalf of, our audience today for enlightening us about the Great Barrier Reef.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Jody. Now to everyone watching, a recording of this talk will be uploaded to sydney.edu/science in the next few days. And don't miss our next Lunchbox Science, which is with Professor Dean Rickles on Wednesday, the 12th of August at 12 p.m. And that's entitled, What is Time? So we asked some big questions about history today. We're asking big questions about an abstract concept like time next time. And the registrations are open at sydney.edu.au/science. So thank you, Jody, once more, and thank you for everyone for joining us for Lunchbox Science. We look forward to seeing you again next time.